Good afternoon to all participants of our webinar. My name is Andrius KUBILIUS. I am from Lithuania, member of European Parliament, standing rapporteur on Russia, and also coordinator of Friends of European Russia Forum. And today we have our traditional webinar, so I will not explain too much about the goal of the webinar, but I would say that really it's a very important topic. We shall talk about sanctions on Russia in a very specific way, with very specific, I would call, approach. And of course, sanctions on Russia is a permanent topic which we were discussing on all the different, webinars. Recently, we passed a special resolution in the European Parliament. I was among also initiators of that resolution on sanctions and how are they effective. And well, my conclusion was that yes, sanctions in general are working. At least we can see from revenues which Russia is getting from oil and gas that they went down by 2 times if to compare with what Russia was getting before the war, immediately after the war. Also, there are SWIFT sanctions, but also what we see very clearly, and this is nothing new, that Russia is very good in inventing new schemes how to circumvent sanctions. And that is why, for example, again, imports or incomes of Russia from oil and gas export are still around of 700 million per day of US dollars, and that is exactly, I would say, very simply too much, because we understand how those money can be spent in financing the war. So, as I said, we had a resolution where we, were trying to overview how sanctions are working, and also we were trying to send a political signal, what is needed to be done. And today's seminar exactly will be devoted to that topic, what is needed to be done. And since definitely Russia is not the first country which, is facing Western sanctions, I think that today's, webinar will be very interesting because we shall have possibility to discuss broadly what, Russia can learn from Iran. Which of course is friendly country to Russia. We know how Russia is collaborating in getting drones and some other military equipment, but also as we can see from the paper which was produced by Tom Keatinge from RUSI, Royal United Services Institute, on exactly that topic with the title "Developing Bad Habits: What Russia Might Learn from Iran's Sanctions Evasion." We shall have opportunity to go more deeply into really in understanding what Russia can learn and how we can prevent that. Implementation of Iran experience by Russia. So I will stop here explaining what is our webinar about. We shall have 3 speakers, Tom Keatinge from RUSI, Director of the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies, also Gustav GRESSEL, Senior Policy Fellow from ECFR, and Vladimir MILOV, Vice President, Free Russia Foundation, who knows very well all the issues related with sanctions. So now 2 words about logistics. As always, I will repeat, we shall have this webinar only in English. So each speaker will have around of 10 minutes to speak out, maybe a little bit more. Then questions and answers, questions which should be put on chat. And the whole webinar, I hope, will continue for 1 hour, not much more, because if the discussions will be very hot, I will be late to my plane from Strasbourg. So that is the reason also. So now, really, I will give the floor without any other introductory remarks to Tom Tom Keatinge, who really will present this valuable report, which he produced together with all the team from RUSI. Please, Tom, go on.
Andrius, thank you very much. I'm pleased to say that I'm not on my bicycle this time, which is where I was last time.
Yes.
You kindly invited me to contribute to a webinar, and it's a pleasure to see Gustav and Vladimir as well. So yes, I'm going to talk about this nexus question with Iran. I have a small presentation that I will share, and the presentation will be circulated to attendees afterwards, and of course I will refer to the paper. And the paper, as Andrius mentioned, is called Developing Bad Habits: What Russia Might Learn from Iran's Sanctions Evasion and How Europe Should Respond. Let's remember, we need to always think about how we should respond as well. So in brief, what does the paper look at? Well, it highlights the experience of what we term rogue states in sanctions evasion. And there are two states in particular that come to mind when we think about that, obviously North Korea and Iran. And for the paper, I focused primarily on Iran, and I'll explain why as we go through the paper. In terms of responding to this, it's European governments, of course, that need to respond to this, but also the private sector. We've all talked, and indeed that recent paper from the Parliament that Andrius mentioned talks about the importance of implementation and enforcement. And when it comes to implementation, this is the responsibility of the private sector. And what we can expect, and indeed what we clearly see evidence of already, is Russia seeking to establish parallel financial relations with places like Iran that obviously aim to avoid as much as possible the sanctions that have been set against Russia by Ukraine's allies. And you can find the paper, the screenshot on the right. The full paper is on the RUSI website. So moving ahead, I think everyone knows, but just briefly, obviously, Iran has been subject to various forms of sanctions since 1979. They have more experience of evading sanctions than I imagine many people on this call have years of life. And starting with trade restrictions from the US in 1979, they were designated a state sponsor of terrorism by the United States in 1984. And let's remember, in those years, the US domination of global economy was considerable, much more so than it is today. So that really made a difference to Iran. And then obviously nuclear-related UN Security Council resolutions in the early 2000s. And then during the Trump presidency, we had the maximum pressure campaign following the withdrawal of the United States from the nuclear deal. Its economy is worth about $90 billion, so small change compared to the Russian economy, but it still needs to export oil and import goods to support its economy and its military. And it has a long history of developing evasion networks. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said in 2007 that it should develop a resistance economy. And this concept of resistance economy is at the heart of its evasion tactics, which are wide-ranging and sophisticated. So when we think about Iran's journey of financial system innovation, and this is necessarily a sort of a short version, there's much more in the paper, clandestine activity is key. It still needs access to dollars. I think one of the things we've seen in the Russia story is that there's only so many Indian rupees you want to be paid for your oil. People want to use the dollar for all the benefits that it brings in terms of stability, convertibility, and general broad ability to use it. And so what does that mean? It means that Iran needs to generate dollar income, and it needs to find ways to spend it. And of course, this is the same conundrum that Russia faces in the face of the sanctions that are being arrayed against it by Ukraine's allies. So making money is the key objective. I'm not going to talk about finding ways to spend it. I'm going to talk about making money, the key objective. And there are two main ways that Iran looks to make money. It secretly converts its domestic currency and assets into dollars. But the problem with doing that is that you can't do it at the scale and the volume that's needed. And you also obviously can't necessarily do that through the kind of sale of oil and the rest that Iran is involved in. So the core activity is generating funds through illicit activity, through what we term in the paper intermediary trading. So what does that mean? So there are some good examples, courtesy of designations from OFAC, the Office for Foreign Assets Control of the US Treasury. And if you look at the designations that OFAC has brought forward since 2019, in other words, since the United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, there are some really interesting case studies that show how the US has tried to disrupt Iranian oil sales, in particular to East and South Asia. And I must say that I would like to see from other sanctioning jurisdictions, I'd like to see the kind of detail that OFAC provides in its designations, because it really does give you an insight into why entities are being designated, what activities they're up to. And for the private sector, that's, of course, very valuable information. So anyway, the US has been targeting these crucial oil brokerage nodes. So two in particular, the Persian Gulf Petrochemical Industries Company. It's Iran's largest and most profitable petrochemical holding company. A series of sanctions in June 2019. Then Triliance Petrochemical Company, which is based in Hong Kong. It's a broker instructing payments for oil delivery. And then there's an interesting nexus with Turkey and Gibraltar, which has also found itself in the crosshairs of sanctions, the Sitki-IM and ASB group. So we've had a range of further designations following those initial designations. But a key point in all of this is just how much involved the international correspondent banks are in settling these foreign currency trades. Although these are clandestine activities, they're actually carried out in full view. It's just that the front companies and so on that Iran uses obfuscate the activity. There's a very interesting website called Wiki Iran. And if you look there, it's where there are leaks posted, leaks which I have corroborated. They're not manufactured. If you speak to some of the banks that feature in those leaks, they go, yes, those are true. We didn't realize we were moving money for the Iranians, but now we do, and we don't do it anymore. So I think it's very interesting to see just how much Iran is still using the international banking system, and with it, the international financial architecture, about more of which in a moment. Another key point to note is the kind of common facilitation locations that are being used by Iran. Turkey, China, Hong Kong, the UAE, all jurisdictions that we know already are being used by Russia. And these are jurisdictions that have weak supervisory regimes, and they are high-risk jurisdictions for Western banks to operate in, but yet Western banks do still choose to operate in those jurisdictions. So meanwhile, what's Russia doing? And others on the call have much more insight into this than I do, but they're obviously seeking new markets for their commodities, and we might talk about price cap circumvention as part of this conversation. Denominating bilateral trade in local currencies. There was a particular and well-reported meeting just over a year ago between Putin and Khamenei about kind of how they're going to de-dollarize their trade. We see the Russian and Iranian financial systems starting to integrate with settlement systems, with the bank card networks being collected. And then I think this is a really interesting area to look at. There are trade blocks, beyond the EU that have an opportunity for Russia to abuse them. And I want to talk in particular about the Asian Clearing Union, which is something that very few people know about, but which I think should be properly understood. So one other point I make from the 2023 foreign policy concept of the Russian Federation, it is clearly a strategic priority to evade sanctions. And in that document, it talks about new national and trans-border payment systems are becoming widespread. There is a growing interest in new international reserve currencies, and prerequisites for diversifying international economic cooperation mechanisms are being created. In other words, we need to get away from the strength of the US dollar, the euro, and other G7 currencies. So just on leveraging trading blocks, I think many people on the call will be familiar with the Eurasian Economic Union. But I did want to spend a few minutes, and there's a case study page in the report about the Asian Clearing Union. Now, the Asian Clearing Union is what we call a net settlement system for trade. It was formed in 1974 at a time when a group of countries, and those countries now include Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Iran, Maldives, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, a group of countries that essentially wanted to trade together, but didn't have the liquidity to pay each other all the time. And so what they did was they created a net settlement system where every now and again, countries would figure out were they in deficit, were they in profit with each other, and they would just do a net settlement. So instead of lots of dollars having to move around, they would just settle the net amount. And what that means is that countries can trade with each other without having to use the US dollar. It's only the beginning and the end of the system that then has to settle the trade. And I think a concern that we should have is whether Russia would join that group, because then it would essentially enter a customs or trade union where the US dollar would really not have to be used very much at all. And this Asian Clearing Union, I think, is ripe for facilitating US dollar evasion. And if you look at some of the countries that are part of that union already, obviously Iran is sanctioned by unilaterally by the United States and by others. Myanmar is obviously subject to sanction as well. So I think we should put a close eye on the Asian Clearing Union. Just briefly on the financial system response. Obviously, rogue states are very familiar with the way banks' processes and regulatory requirements work. And as I mentioned up front, the formal financial system is still systemically abused by Iran as part of these clandestine finance systems, which was written about in quite a lot of detail by the Wall Street Journal in early 2022. They know how to exploit weak supervisory regimes. That's information that is available to everybody, and they know how to use intermediaries. And these, we obviously already seeing Russia learning some of these tricks. And many of these transactions hide in plain sight. They use hubs like the UAE, or they use Hong Kong with its import-export businesses to, as I say, hide their transactions in plain sight. So, just very briefly, how should European governments and the private sector respond? The critical point in all of this is that for the banks, compliance does not equal effectiveness. So even some of the best-in-class banks, if you look at wikiiran.org, you'll see some blue chip, some banner names there of banks that you would think have great compliance systems, but yet the Iranians are still able to use their services undetected. Everyone obviously has to comply with the FATF standards, but the FATF standards do not, in our view, equip the financial system to address state-based abuse by rogue states. FATF is there to deal with criminal finance, but state-based abuse is much more sort of somewhat beyond the scope of the FATF. Think how well most European states have performed in their Financial Action Task Force evaluations. But then when you come to their ability to implement sanctions on Russia, as of February 2022, it was initially quite weak before they got themselves organized. So a lot of evasion opportunities exist. And we rely heavily on the banking system. We say, banks, you need to be implementing sanctions. But what about the clearing and settlement systems, all the architecture that goes around banking that moves money around the world? Let's think about that. And lastly, we need to provide the banks with information that actually allows them to use their data effectively. What are the tools being used by Iran? What are the tools being used by Russia? How can you identify their activity? Don't leave them to try and work it out by themselves. So got here a few points that we need to think about. We need to think about the risks that exist. Obviously, great collaboration on Russia sanctions. We need to build on that. We need to see collaboration on securing the financial system, not just against abuse by Russia, but abuse by Iran and North Korea. We need to go beyond the FATF standards. We need to educate and empower the private sector. And we need to make sure that we are robust in identifying and naming evasion platforms, whether it's the Asian Credit Union, if that were to occur, or specific countries. And my last sort of recommendation for the EU would be, let's think about developing an integrated sanctions response to evasion abuse by rogue states. Obviously, Russia has been the focus, but let's remember that Russia is developing relationships with rogue states, and we need to be as concerned about Iran and North Korea as we are about Russia. Not something that's happened historically, but something that should perhaps be happening in the future. So with that, thank you for listening. There's some information here about podcast recording we did with David O'Sullivan, the EU Sanctions Envoy, and our sanctions work at RUSI. But as I mentioned at the beginning, this presentation will be shared afterwards, so you can take this information at a later date. Thank you, Andrius. Back to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Tom. Thanks a lot, really, a lot of questions, but let's move now to other speakers. And Gustav, floor is going to you.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. Unfortunately, I can't present such a brilliant and detailed presentation. I'm not an economic expert and neither a expert control guy. I'm kind of the military expert and missile defense guy. So why am I here on the panel? Well, there has been quite deep Iranian, Russian, North Korean cooperation. At the time, both regimes were under sanctions, North Korea and Iran. That is going back to the 90s. There's very deep cooperation between the intelligence service in organizing smuggling of arms goods, and that provides sort of the underlying vibe for the kind of smuggling in reverse. First, it was out of Russia into North Korea, from North Korea into other countries or into Iran, and now it's of course sort of payback time for the old hegemon. And I will try to illustrate that on sort of traceable examples, and just to show you how long this was going on. So probably everybody is familiar with the R-17 missile that became famous under its NATO designation, the Scud. This missile was produced from the 50s onward in the Soviet Union, and it saw widespread use across Soviet Middle East clients in the Middle East. After the Cold War, if you open conventional literature on North Korea and Iran, there were supposedly copies made both in Iran and in North Korea, being called Nodong and Shahab. So Nodong in North Korea and Shahab in Iran. The problem is actually copying these missiles is quite tricky. And after we saw and dismantled the Iraqi missile program, actually we came to grasp on how complicated this really was. The Scud alone is made up of, or Scud engine alone is made up of over 200 parts. A lot of them are stamped steel. Stamped steel is behaving differently under pressure and heat, and there's a lot of pressure and heat in a rocket motor, depending on how you treat it when stamped, at which temperature, at what pressure the metal is stamped. You can't reverse engineer that, because if you have this kind of sheet metal or a stamped metal in your hand, you can determine how thick it is and what properties it has metallurgically, but you cannot determine under which processes it was formed. So from the very beginning, people were doubtful whether they were actually copies, and the doubts were basically reinforced by two happy events. There was an enlarged copy of the Scud called Shahab 3 in Iran, presented at the Tehran International Air Show in 1998. Allegedly, this missile was developed in North Korea and then produced in Iran. When it was presented in Iran in 1998, all the maintenance hatches had still their Russian inscription on them. Now you can wonder why a missile that was produced and produced in Iran and developed in North Korea has Russian inscriptions all over the place. Well, I guess it wasn't that much Iranian. Then the Scud itself in 2003, in early 2003, in run-up to the war in the Gulf, the Spanish Navy had stopped a freighter in the Sea of Oman with North Korean Scud missiles on board. It basically went under in the whole discussion back then. But the funny thing about this was a North Korean freighter. There was at the time fear that the missiles might go elsewhere in the Middle East. Finally, they determined they were going to Oman. But the actual news on the discoveries, the Spanish made detailed photographs of the missiles, the motors, as much as sort of they could go into detail there. And looking at the missiles, these supposedly North Korean missiles have all Russian markings and inventory numbers. Why, if there are North Korean license production. Now, Mr. Emerson unfortunately died much too early on cancer. He was working for the IISS on missile proliferation, and even for bigger North Korean missiles that were tested from 2017 onwards. He concluded that, well, they're actually flying on Russian engines. Well, of course, the frame of these and the kind of exact arrangements of the stages is made in North Korea. The engines are still Russian. This kind of cooperation continued into other systems as well. If you noticed in 2019, we had a short crisis in the Persian Gulf when the Iranians shot down a American Poseidon drone, a naval reconnaissance surveillance drone that was sort of flying in international waters in the Persian Gulf. It was shot down by a missile that was called Rad. The Rad was supposedly developed in Iran. Supposedly Iran was a long time under sanctions and of course couldn't buy any equipment from major power. The funny thing about the Rad is it looks like a book. It has the dimensions of the book. It behaves electronically like a book. The radar behaves like a fire control radar from a book system. I was just wondering, isn't it a book system with just 3 launchers instead of 4 on the rails? Yeah. Sort of, and to be further skeptical on that, developing an air defense system is not a piece of cake. If you have the capability to really develop and produce something on your own, you don't produce copies, because each mechanical system or each weapon system is a kind of a result of compromises that are tailored to your own armed forces and the requirement under which they are developed. If you have the development and capability to do something on your own, you tailor it to your own needs and not to the ones of other powers. It happened to a similar weapon system that also has a Russian origin, which is called Bavar 373, which by now actually is manufactured in Iran. That's why it differs from its original, which is the S-300, the first iterations of the S-300. As you can remember, probably once upon a time, Benjamin Netanyahu struck a deal with Vladimir Putin that Russia would not export sophisticated air defense systems on the table at the time, the S-300 system, to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And as a compensation, Israel helped Russia develop reconnaissance drones. These reconnaissance drones are built on Israeli models, are happily flying over Ukraine these days. And Iran all of a sudden had a lookalike of the S-300 at home that was supposedly developed in North Korea again and repainted in Iran. Iranians, with technical assistance from Russia, managed to build actually, under this designation, a system that is very similar to the S-300, but different because, again, they had to tailor it to things they had there, and it's really locally produced there with Russian startup help, but still. So what I try to do is this cooperation isn't new. Unfortunately, the last arms control treaty that was really up to the task, that was paranoid enough to use the phrase what sort of the arms control advocates accuse people like us these days, that had a robust implementation mechanism, was the INF. This was an arms control treaty where parties didn't trust themselves that it would actually implement it and had really robust implementation systems. All others are basically good faith agreements. The missile technology control regime is a good faith agreement, and Russia never kept it. This military cooperation, of course, now is going into the reverse direction. Iran is now helping Russia, not only building the famous Shahid drones in Russia and equipping them, they're also delivering radar systems, electronic warfare systems, or subcomponents to that to Russia, because they have ample experience in the Middle East playing with these systems around. Both countries have very close cooperation, sometimes a bit friction, but still close cooperation in Syria. There's an amicable relationship between the Islamic Republican Guard Corps and the GRU, and last but not least, Iran uses a lot of Soviet caliber style artillery and rocket artillery systems that enable Iran to produce ammunition for the Russian war machine, which is also a significant part. Iran will produce or has produced this year roughly the same amount of artillery shells, slightly less, but roughly the same amount as Europe in its entirety, and shipped to Ukraine. And what we ship to Ukraine from Europe, Iran has given to Russia. On this, in 2010, the Russians have modernized their ammunition production facilities, greatly making use of Austrian machinery. And they sold their old Soviet stuff, production lines for both artillery barrels as well as artillery ammunition. And guess where they sold it? Predominantly North Korea, but some stuff also ended up in Iran. And there it can still produce happily for the former owner and now customer. And that's why the Russians have particularly been reaching out to these two countries to get ammunition back. Now, what the West can do to tighten sanctions is pretty similar to what my predecessor said. You need to carefully analyze where each of the Iranian subcomponents that you find in weapons used in Ukraine come from, track down the enterprises, track down the production lots, track down the intermediaries. It's the same country, Turkey, Hong Kong, that are predominantly used to smuggling technology both into Russia as well as into Iran. There is, of course, especially with Turkey, with the ongoing accession of Sweden into NATO, very few appetite to apply pressure. But in Europe, it's also a matter of sort of how faithful we keep to our own sanctions. Going back to Austrian machinery for Russian ammunition production, yeah, Austria has signed the sanctions of the EU, but implementation is, yeah, subpar. And within the European Union, the implementation of common foreign and security policy measures, such as sanctions, is up to the member states, and the member states control themselves in the Council. That doesn't work well. It's not under the jurisdiction of the EU court. It's not under the jurisdiction of the prosecutor's office against financial crimes in the European Union. So there's no external control within the EU whether actually we keep up to sanctions or not. The enforcer of EU sanctions so far, including the military rearm, are basically US secondary sanctions. If it weren't for US secondary sanctions, you know, the Putin-Versteher in most of Europe would have a good day selling whatever they like. Unfortunately, the American insistence on implementation and persistence with that is, I mean, they can track a certain amount of sanction breaches at a time, and given the increase of sanctions regimes they need to monitor, we see now basically the limit of that kind of enforcement mechanism. And that is a problem for the Europeans, because we start to lose, our own systems are starting to lose credibility if we can't police our own laws because of the flaws of the systems that have created them. It's becoming a bit embarrassing. And Ukrainians find enough Western technology in both Iranian and Russian weapons that come down over the country, unfortunately. So that's my short intervention.
Okay, thanks a lot, Gustav. Thanks a lot for all very precise technical explanation what is happening. And now I'm turning to Vladimir. Vladimir, we know you that you are a great expert on sanctions. Go on.
Yeah, thank you very much. And really extremely interesting and very detailed interventions by colleagues, and Tom, absolutely brilliant report on the Iranian example. I keep rereading it like a good detective, you know, but my presentation will not be as much detail focused as much as policy response focused. First, I think it's important to understand that all this important amount of details and nuance, they have to be written for someone to actually learn and implement them. And here we have the problem, colleagues slightly touched upon it, but I think we need to double down. The system of implementation of Western sanctions is extremely understaffed. And I know, I understand all the budgetary constraints, but we need to bring that issue on top of the agenda, because in the previous several decades, economic sanctions were used in a limited number of really narrow case-specific examples, against relatively small economies. Iran or North Korea are, a fraction of a percent of global GDP. However, what we are talking right now is an emerging, probably unfortunately, I have to say it, although it might make someone unhappy, a lengthy, protracted standoff with a network of rogue states which are challenging the global order. So implementation of sanctions, I think it needs to be clearly understood that it should be a systemic effort. Many efforts should be put into it, like the international community puts into fighting organized crime, money laundering, terrorist activities, drugs, human trafficking, whatever. So at the moment, we see that many measures are being introduced, but they are not supported by sufficient implementation, compliance monitoring, and penalties and action mechanisms, and this should be catching up. Because if you just read Tom's report, you will see that basically many specialists should be involved in this on a daily basis. What is interesting also is all these clandestine systems by rogue states, they are permanently evolving. They learn from various attempts of Western governments to shut down certain schemes, so they become more sophisticated. So it's really what we're talking about is not just like introduce some sanctions and punish some few people who were caught for non-compliance, and that's it, markets will adjust. No, what we see here is a very sophisticated system of permanent adjustment to all this pressure, creation of alternative clandestine networks disconnected from normal global financial system. So we need experts, and we need permanent track and crack, if you will, system, pretty much the same as the humanity is combating, again, like organized crime or money laundering or whatever. So again, before, sanctions were approached as some like one-time deal. You do not comply with UN resolution on nuclear weapons program, we impose sanctions, you cooperate, we remove. That's not the situation that we have today. We have a number of rogue states which are challenging global order, and that is evolving into a protracted standoff. So we need to develop a system of actually monitoring compliance and cracking down on all these clandestine schemes. The second thing is like not one, but several elephants in the room, which are major economies, which cannot be classified as rogue states. They are normal participants of the International Division of Labor, but they tend to cooperate with all these rogue states and provide them significant assistance. Tom has been mentioning some firms in Hong Kong, China, United Arab Emirates, Turkey, which are assisting some of that schemes. Here is also the vulnerability for the rogue states, because let me put it plainly, they will not be able to sustain a lot of these clandestine networks if not the assistance from all these major states. It's not just China, because, for instance, the Asian Clearing Union that was mentioned, it also includes India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, so some major economies. In this regard, it is very important to develop and exercise a strategy of diplomatic pressure, anything from just diplomatic dialogue to real imposition of secondary sanctions against these big third countries, which are not the rogue states in question, but who are strongly assisting them by harboring some of the schemes and assisting them to operate. Which means that this is a more complicated picture than just democratic West versus rogue states. All these, they will not be able to operate without all these major assistance from key economies like China, India, Turkey, and the others. So we need to develop a strategy on how to work with them to actually achieve shutting down all these schemes. And third, I have to add a little bit room for optimism from my point of view, because yes, these countries, Russia and Iran particularly, have been pretty active in developing all these clandestine financial networks, but they also have major weaknesses. And Tom, you mentioned the issue with Indian rupees, which Russian market players just don't want because they have nowhere to spend them. that's pretty interesting phenomenon because the currencies of all these countries in question are not in demand by the market players because they are overly regulated, they are extremely volatile, a lot of restrictions imposed on them. So that's a big difficulty in itself. This is actually why they still, as you correctly said, they still need the dollar because all these, papers which they are printing, they are really not in demand internationally. The other thing, and this directly also relates to military production, it is very, very difficult to develop competitive manufacturing industries and products in all this narrow chamber environment of this triangle of rogue states. Still, Russia is a relatively big economy, one in top 15 of the global economies, but if you summarize Russia, Iran, and North Korea, that is still just around like 2.5% of global GDP. That is insufficient scale to develop their own manufacturing of sophisticated competitive products. Just pretty interesting, I can send this along. The day before yesterday, a Russian business newspaper, Kommersant, has published an article based on a detailed survey of a Russian union of industrialists and entrepreneurs. They've been asking the questions as to how the import substitution is working and why it is actually not working in a lot of cases. That's the problem number one that's been mentioned. Our market is insufficient in scale to develop our own manufacturing of competitive products, and we do not have access to major outside markets. Pretty interestingly, neither the rogue states nor their assistants like China and others are pretty much happy to open their own borders for inflow of manufacturing products from each other. They try to do it on their own. They see each other as competitors in manufacturing products. And that's a pretty interesting phenomenon. We should see these cracks and we should exploit them, which is why, again, I'm fairly optimistic that despite all this cooperation and clandestine networks, Russia, Iran, and North Korea will not be able to develop a fully functioning alternative, as Tom quoted Ayatollah Khamenei, resistance economies. They will still be dependent on using these clandestine networks. They will still need high liquidity, globally demanded international currencies like the dollar, which means that the Western pressure in the long run might work. But again, I will finish by saying it needs significant beefing up in stuff, because I mean, just by reading Tom's report, it becomes very clear that it takes many specialists to be focused on these schemes, tracking, analyzing them, and offering policy proposals to shut them down. Currently, there's no sufficient capacity for that.
Well, thanks, Vladimir. Thanks very much. Really was very interesting to listen your presentations. You are so convincing that for time being, audience is digesting your statements, and still no questions on the chat. But really, maybe I will make some kind of comment or general question. Oh, immediately somebody came out. Vladimir, question was for you, I saw. Just and remind that you should look all into the chat. But yeah, I will look more from what both Tom and Gustav have said, and Vladimir was speaking from geopolitical point of view. If we are looking into the situation of today, of course, everybody in the West are saying no, we need to avoid the Third World War and things like that, which is pretty right. We don't want to see really the war and nuclear and things like that to be exploited, because we understand that really it will be a total catastrophe. But if you look from more from geopolitical point of view, you can see very clearly that one front is very clear. Those what Vladimir has called rogue countries, or we can call them authoritarian or terrorist countries, they are united, and they are learning from each other. They are using each other to avoid sanctions and so on and so on. when the West is okay, is going on, is making sanctions, but as we see, each country, especially in the EU, has its own policy. Somebody is controlling, somebody is not controlling. And my point is very simple, So if there is one front, we need to have another front, on our side, much more united, and with very clear geopolitical understanding, that we have to stand against, not individual countries like Russia, Iran, or North Korea, but we need to stand against the whole front, the whole system, and to have joint approach to those countries. For example, what we understand on sanctions policy towards Russia for time being, what the EU is doing. On Belarus, we have different sanctions. And that is what, Russia is using in a very, very effective way, because definitely Belarus is part of Russia for time being. And if, sanctions, for example, to import cars to Belarus are still not in place, then Russians are importing through Belarus all automobiles and cars and so on and so on. So this is my short comment, but I see that really questions are coming, and maybe, I will start again from the beginning. Tom, maybe you can react to some of the questions, or to those who were speaking after you. Please, your comment on both on the questions and
yeah,
on the comments. Yeah.
No, of course. Thank you very much. I mean, Gustav, I'm sure, can talk about the weapons questions, but I guess I would say that I think this is more than about weapons. Clearly, weapons really matter, but this is more than about weapons. And I think what we're trying to do, and Vladimir made this point very strongly, is we're trying to galvanize the system to respond. And I think what we want to avoid doing is making excuses that, well, I'm not involved in weapons, so why should I worry about restricting the resourcing and the funding of the Russian military. So I think, as you rightly said, Andrius, this is a kind of whole of society response to rogue states that kind of challenge the norms and standards that we stand for. So I think, yes, weapons delivery bans and policing those would be great, but I think there's much more to it than all of that. I think there's an interesting question here about, does the EU West stance on the Israel-Gaza war push potential rogue states towards more cooperation? I mean, what's interesting, and I think this is kind of at the heart of why I think the EU needs to sort of think, what is its integrated sanctions response? I think what's interesting is, obviously, we are very much aligned with the Americans in Europe when it comes to Ukraine, but on other topics, we're not so aligned. Now, we don't need to follow the Americans, of course. We are our own countries. We make our own decisions. But I do think that prior to February 2022, thinking about sanctions in Europe was just a political messaging topic. It was an MFA topic. Now it's much more of a genuine tool that we want to use to confront rogue actors. And so that's why I think the EU needs to kind of think again about how it's going to approach sanctions as a strategy, not just as a response to Russia on Ukraine.
Okay, Gustav, I see questions on this, Austria production. Can you say something if you see the chat?
I saw. So basically, the thing with Austrian production was we had during the Cold War indigenous production for a lot of artillery and tank gun munition in Austria. Austria was neutral during the Cold War, and they had a state-owned arms industry, and they produced this kind of stuff. Now, in 2010, Hirtenberger was the major ammunition production. And they also have the tooling enterprises that produce the machines to produce ammunition. Now, that because of neutrality, this business basically went out of business, because Austria was restricting the arms industry to export only to friendly countries in the West who basically had their own defense industry and didn't bother about buying Austrian stuff. And so they closed down, and Austria's production facilities for producing artillery shells were in 2010 sold to Edinburgh's sort of artillery ammunition branch. The machinery park that was in 2010 sold to via intermediate companies to Russia. Russia at that time was not under sanctions, but in 2014 it started to come under sanctions, and we all wondered sort of how long they would sustain production without having access to maintenance and spare parts for their machinery. Unfortunately, they still produce ammunition. They still produce artillery shells. And I think 2 weeks ago, there was the kind of scandal. I mean, the company is called GFM Steyr. It's a machine tool company, and they are in charge or have the contract to maintain the machine park in Russia and deliver spare parts. And before that, they said, well, these are old contracts. Now they say, well, we deliver not to Russia, but to but to other countries, and we don't know where it gets exported from there. And people say, well, that's a cheap excuse. You don't even bother to care. The problem here also is, you know, you have, given the Austrian political climate, you have this very similar to Hungary. You have a high acceptance of the kind of the risk supplying things to rogue states. And you also have a very weak surveillance machine / institutions. You have a very, very underfunded small foreign intelligence service that is only mandated to, it's a part of the armed forces, and it's only mandated to basically conduct reconnaissance abroad if it relates to military security and military operations. Now, of course, that doesn't even provide them a legal mandate to kind of look after where Austrian exports go and where they're shipped from if they arrive in, let's say, Turkey. The next thing is that financial supervision and sort of the banking and business supervision bodies, they're highly politicized and they're usually not very effective. I mean, Austria was riddled by banking scandals over the last 2 decades. And there's a reason for that. We have a number of court cases pending for abuse of power, corruption, etc., against former finance ministers and heads of various bodies, well, for a reason. And to be honest, the Russians are very good in using such kind of business environment. If you can corrupt people and if you can sort of use political influence to stall things, this is music to their ears, because they're used to work in such an environment and they're very professional at that and exploiting this, which is what they're doing. So unfortunately, this is kind of part of the problem in the EU.
Okay, and Vladimir, yeah, you have several questions on sanctions impact on Russian economy. I don't know. Can you elaborate on the situation on battlefield, the question, and how it impacts, sanctions? And can weapons delivery sanctions can be more effective than, sanctions on financial or oil sanctions? I don't know what does it mean, but can you try to comment some of those questions?
Yes, and I wrote a paper a month ago for GlobeSec assessing the current situation with the Russian economy and the impact of sanctions. Exactly as Andrius put it, sanctions are working, but much more is needed to shut down Putin's ability to sustain his system and to continue the war. Generally, I think the European Parliament had passed a resolution in November actually outlining very well all the further directions where Russia continues to receive the money. A key question here is money. Russia still continues to receive a lot of money from the Western markets, which are used as a tax revenue for the budget and subsequently to finance the war. So I won't go into too much detail. There are many measures that should be undertaken. So I think the key issue at the moment are not all these clandestine schemes, but the key issue is that Russia continues to export a lot of stuff absolutely freely and unrestrained, and many of those commodities are still not under sanctions, so money keep flowing in. That's the key problem. However, I have to say that the effects are already there. Mind you that the conflict between Wagner Group and the Ministry of Defense, so dramatic, which we observed earlier this year, originated with deficit of artillery shells on the battlefield. And you also see from the events around Kupiansk or Avdiivka that Russia is not able anymore to conduct successful offensive operations. These are like certain major results of the sanctions. Like if you read the reporting from the battlefield and from Russian military bloggers and pro-war Telegram channels, you will see there are huge problems with supplies, with ammunition, with food, with water, with everything. That is clearly connected with the lack of money. And sanctions are actually meant to cut the flow of money into Putin's war machine. So the money is still there. Russia is capable of sustaining the war for some time, but more pressure from the Western side could cut it off and make it more difficult for Putin.
Okay, good. Because I got also one question, I will try to answer very shortly, and then maybe Tom will conclude. There are several questions on 12th package and something like that, but also maybe a final conclusion. My question from Ivan, on very philosophical, why should do we need, the world to divide? The history is crucial in telling us all dictatorships and closed societies would fail earlier or later, and maybe it's time to think about what can unite the future world, then declare de facto division. I will not maybe spend too much of time. I also believe that, dictatorships will fail, especially in Russia. We are preparing, in Parliament, it's my obligation to prepare the second report on EU-Russia relations in the future. But in order, to see such a perspective, really we need to achieve that Putin will lose the war in Ukraine. And that can be achieved only if our sanctions will be effective and if, weapon deliveries to Ukraine will be effective. So this is really what is very much important, but for time being, as we can see, we are not so effective as we would like to see. And Putin is really, very, 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 very inventive to find the ways how to avoid sanctions. I see also here is a question on Iran and Gaza. While I, being from Lithuania, I cannot, run away from some suspicion that Kremlin was also in some way or another way supporting this, Gaza terrorist attack. And now we see the effects, affects political bonds. Even, it's my conclusion, but elections in Netherlands, recent ones, are showing what is an impact of what was happening in Gaza and Israel when in Europe we see, radical right winning elections and being Eurosceptics and so on and so on. This is a different topic, but till we shall, achieve such a situation that authoritarian regimes will start to fail, still big things we need to do, not just waiting. And Tom, maybe you shall, make final conclusions.
That's very kind. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me once again. I want to just pick up on a question from Marek about third countries and kind of the current unfavorable geopolitical environment. And also then there's a question about the 12th package, because I think they go together. So we just spent on our SIFMANET project, we just spent the last 4 days in Georgia doing interviews down there. And this is where you see the reality of being a third country, in their case, sort of stuck between the EU and the desire for EU accession and obviously bordering Russia. And many countries around the world find themselves in some sort of position like that, where they have Russia on one side, metaphorically or physically, and they have the EU and other Western nations on the other side. And very simply, we have to make them make a choice, but a choice that they want to make, not a coerced choice, a choice that they want to make, to bring them to see that actually their long-term future lies with the West and it doesn't lie with Russia. And so for me, this is the most important thing that we should be doing. That's why I think it's great that we have a diplomat as the EU sanctions envoy. We don't have a policeman. You know, the Americans use a policeman. The Europeans use a diplomat. I think that's very important, a very important point. And on the 12th package, you know, look, for credibility's sake, if the EU is going to continue to be a credible player in sanctions, it needs to be able to move faster than it does right now. Because at the moment, you know, if the Spaniards cannot get the 12th package over the line and it's not a package which shows a good punch, then Putin is starting to win the sanctions war, unfortunately. So we need to maintain momentum. It's absolutely critical because messaging is everything in this fight. Thank you, Andrius.
Well, yeah, thanks a lot, Tom. Thanks a lot, Gustav, and thanks a lot, Vladimir. Really, it was very, very interesting conversation. It's, you know, sorry for quite a short time because I need to run to my plane. But in any case, it's very clear that, you know, sanctions and sanction policy is a very important topic, and it's becoming more and more important. So we shall continue on those issues. And definitely, you know, we want to see Europe becoming more effective, you know, both in implementation and in design of the policy. That is why, you know, when we were discussing sanctions resolution in the parliament, I proposed to start to think about next commission and maybe, you know, in order to have really much more clear policy on sanctions as very important instrument of our general policies, maybe it would be good to have a special commissioner on sanctions policy. You know, and you know, Ambassador Sullivan is doing you know, great job, but why not to have also, you know, commissioner who will be responsible for you know, really both overview and design of sanctions policy, because as we see there, this is one of very important topics which we need to be effective in implementation. So again, thanks a lot to all of you. Good luck. We are waiting for new reports, new papers on those topics, and we are ready now really to continue our discussions. Thanks a lot. Good luck.